Hey guys, hope you had a good Tuesday. I spent most of the day at a trampoline park with my kids. And you know the parents that get called in the loudspeaker because their kid can't find them? That was me today. Right here. That was me. I was with my two other children, but my other one had to walk right past us to get the announcement called. So that happened. That was the first for me today. It was not relaxing. The trampoline park is not relaxing for parents. And what do I do to decompress? My kids are watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I'm thinking about American politics. So that gives you some perspective. So let's talk a little bit about Wyoming. Wyoming is in the news today because there's a big primary race in the state of Wyoming. What is a primary? A primary is kind of a pre-election where each political party typically puts forward candidates, and the people get to choose which candidate will represent which political party in the election that is going to happen in November. In a state like Wyoming, which is heavily Republican, whoever will win this primary election will most likely win the general election. Wyoming is one of just a handful of states like Montana and Delaware, that only have one representative in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Learned a couple really fun facts about the state of Wyoming. Love the state of Wyoming. And if you're there, a couple of you have written me today, which I appreciate. Beautiful state. Learned that Wyoming is actually America's least populated state. I'm sure many of you would like to keep it that way, but it's so beautiful, it's hard to stay away. Its population is just under 600,000 people, so that's smaller than major cities in the country. You know, the whole state of Wyoming is less populated than the city of Austin, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. Of the just under 600,000 people that live in the state, you have just under 300,000 registered voters, the majority of which are Republican. But in a typical primary election season, you may not see such a focus on Wyoming. So why now? It all has to do with Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Congresswoman Liz Cheney, as you know, has served in the House of Representatives for several years now. She has been an outspoken critic of President Trump and has served as the co-chair of the House Select Committee investigating January 6th. She's running against an opponent that is backed by former President Trump and who supports the president. And so you have two very different Republican candidates facing off against each other. Like any good news story, there are actually several plot lines to sort of explore here. Yes, we just have the basic headline: will Congresswoman Liz Cheney survive this particular challenge from a candidate backed by President Trump? Number two, what does this say about party identity? You know, how much strength does the former president have when it comes to picking candidates that are going to win? And what does the Republican Party's identity look like? Not only going into November 2022, is it a party defined by President Trump, but who will define the party going into 2024 when we have a major presidential cycle? But there's something even bigger than this that I think has less to do with party and more to do with you. And I'm really curious what you think about this. I've spent some time reading and listening to different voters in Wyoming talk about how they're feeling about this election. And there certainly is a diversity of opinion. By the way, this is an open primary. So that means a Democrat could walk into an election site and cast a ballot in favor of Liz Cheney, because anybody from any party can participate in the primary, which is really interesting. That's not true of every state. And there's not that many Democrats in the state of Wyoming to like flip the issue if all Democrats got together and supported her. But that is something just to note. You know, most of the national media has sort of focused on this January 6th issue. And there's been an insinuation that the voters in Wyoming just don't care about January 6th and therefore just want to vote Congresswoman Cheney out of office. But if you really listen to them, they're saying a couple different things. It comes down to a question about representation. There are voters in Wyoming that say, hey, listen, we actually support President Trump. That's not supporting what happened on January 6th. They're saying they support President Trump. They don't necessarily want to see him impeached, for example. And they felt that Congresswoman Cheney went rogue. that she wasn't listening to them at all, that she was making decisions on her own path, representing herself, but not representing constituents. And that's where I think there's a really big question to ask here about a political class in America in general. Because when people talk about standing for democracy, and that's something that Congresswoman Cheney has talked a lot about defending democracy and the American way of life, that really has to do with representation in Congress. And so that is a question, and I'm curious what you think about it. Do you elect people to represent the majority of how people think in your area? Do you elect them to make their own decisions considering their unique perspective on the world? And here's where you could kind of flip the story around and say, well, Congresswoman Cheney does have a unique perspective on what happened on January 6th, because unlike her constituents, she was actually there in Washington, D.C. She actually, at points during his term, interacted with President Trump. So she does have a different perspective than those living in her district or in her state that she's representing. But that question of, how people are representing us and what that looks like, what's our expectation? Is our expectation that our representatives we send to Washington, D.C. to represent the majority of how someone feels in our area, or are we electing them to sort of think independently depending on what's put in front of them? What do you think about that? I always like to stand back from some of these stories and look at different themes that are coming up, and especially when it comes up to politics, but also in media. This theme of betrayal, of people in America feeling betrayed by those in power, betrayed by those who they elected, betrayed by those that are reporting America's news. And by the way, this really cuts both sides. You could say that Congresswoman Liz Cheney felt betrayed by President Trump and his leadership. And you can say supporters of President Trump feel betrayed by Congresswoman Cheney. But you also see this in the Democrat Party as well. So I'm curious about this. Number one, do you feel betrayed? Number two, what do you think is the most accurate expectation for elected representatives these days, considering how American politics is working? Because if we don't know what our expectations are, then how do we judge whether someone is performing or not? Just take it a step further, maybe some of the division in America today is not just about party platforms, but about what our expectations are of those that are in politics. How much power they have, what sort of decisions they're making, and what we think of them. Just something easy to think about on a Tuesday night. We'll be watching for the results out of Wyoming, and we'll see what different people say, how they extrapolate what happens in Wyoming, whether or not that could apply more nationwide. What does it say about the power of President Trump? What does it say about political decisions made by some Republicans over the last year or two? But I think there's a broader question about American politics in general and representation, and I look forward to your thoughts.